So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this evening's session. My name is Cyril Brightman. I'm the director of the English Language Desk of Yad Vashem's International Relations Division. The advertised lecture was entitled Children During the Holocaust by Dr. Sharon Candace-Cohen. Unfortunately, her father passed away yesterday, so she obviously can't join us for the lecture. We're very fortunate to have a Holocaust survivor, Tswi Herschel, who has agreed to make a presentation entitled The Story of a Hidden Child, his own story, which we're privileged to hear this evening. So without any further ado, I won't introduce Tswi because that's part of his story and he'll tell us all about it. Folks, we have muted everybody because sometimes when people are unmuted, there can be disruptive sounds in the background. So this way it makes a more pleasant presentation and more audible presentation for everyone. So please bear that in mind. And the other thing is that there will be a Q&A session at the end. If you have any questions, please type your questions into the chat and we will hopefully be able to address many of them towards the end. So if you can take the screen down right now, please, and then Tswi will begin.
Okay. Good evening, all the listeners from all over the world. I thank you very much that you're going to listen to my story. And hold on. Here I give a lecture in Germany, and I'm holding the life calendar my father drew when I was born. His vision was going to be with his firstborn son in a very dark time of the Shoah. Let's start with a little bit of history. On May the 10th, 1940, the Nazis
So you need to unmute yourself. You've muted yourself.
Or it went automatically. Okay. Immediately after the occupation, the Nazis were, the Dutch authorities collaborated with the Nazis. The first measure, also immediately after the occupation of the Germans, was the confiscation of the Jewish assets and the registration of the Jews. They had to fill in a form for how many Jewish grandparents they have. For Jews, it was prohibited to work for non-Jews. And it was also not allowed to visit public places, let's say a cafe, the parks, swimming pools, etc., etc. And there was an evening curfew. Already in spring 1941 were the first transportations of the Dutch Jews to the concentration camps. As a matter of fact, my grandfather was one of the first to Auschwitz. Yeah, my parents, Nico Louis Herschel, born in 1915, guest in Sobibór in 1943, 27 years old. My mother, Amiel, born in 1919, guest murdered on the same day, and she was 24. They married in 1942, March 1942. And 9 months later, in December, I was born. And this is the life calendar my father drew, his vision, which is actually remarkable that 90% came out. It's the truth. This calendar is in the permanent exhibition in the Holocaust Museum in Washington. The Jews of Holland were forced to live in the ghetto in April 1943. The ghetto of Amsterdam was a collecting point. And from there, the Jews were transported by train to the camp Westerbork, the concentration camp Westerbork in Holland. The camp Westerbork, the concentration camp Westerbork, was one of the 4 Dutch concentration camps. In April 1943, I was smuggled out of the ghetto of Amsterdam. My parents were forced to move from Zwolle to live in the ghetto. And my father was looking for a place for me to go into hiding. I was smuggled out of the ghetto by a 17-year-old girl who I found 51 years later. She brought me into hiding by a Dutch Protestant family in Oosterbeek. This is the house where I was in hiding by the family de Jong. My name was Henkie de Jong. In September 1944, Montgomery, after he defeated General Rommel in the El Alamein in North Africa, started Operation Market Garden to safeguard the bridges over the Rhine, and one of them was in Arnhem. It was a disaster, and at that moment, the war started for me. The house where I was in hiding was bombed. It got a direct hit, and while we were sitting in the basement. The house got destroyed, got on fire, and we escaped unharmed. Then we were evacuated to a small fishing place, Spakenburg. It's just in the vicinity of Amsterdam. Here I am as a toddler after the liberation in May in 1945. And here is my paternal grandmother who snatched me away from my parents, of the Shoah, my Shoah parents. I did not know that I was Jewish, and I thought that the family de Jong, who took me in as their own child, and they had already 5 children, they treated me with all their love they could give to me, and also my siblings. The moment that my grandmother came and snatched me away, it was the 3rd traumatic event in my life as a little boy. She brought me to Rotterdam, and I lived with her. Snatched from my war parents and forbidden to have contact with them. Can you imagine that you can't see, to talk and meet your own parents? My name, Henkie, changed into Herman. Although later I found out that it wasn't my name. A new religion. The family de Jong was very religious. We went to church. And every day there was the Bible at the table. And during the lunch and after the lunch, they read a chapter out of the Bible. I even today know the prayers. No church. I had to go to the synagogue. The prayers in a foreign language, and not allowed to eat non-kosher food. My grandmother was a datiya. She was religious. So in her eyes, that I had non-kosher food, it was a terrible thing. Because the first thing what she asked my war parents, did he eat pork? I was 8 years old when I discovered my birth name, and that I was an orphan. I kept that for myself for 1 year. And then I asked my grandmother, who is Amiral? And then she started stuttering. And then I said to her, listen, I know who she is. She's my mother, and I'm an orphan. My parents didn't survive. Here's the transportation list on July the 20th, 1943, with their names. There's an original photo from Camp Westerbork, where the Jews were pushed into the cattle cars. Transport to extinction was unavoidable. No escape possible. It was so well organized. The highest percentage of the murdered Jews is in Holland. I was a hidden child. I'm a hidden child survivor and an orphan. I'm one of the children who had to keep silence. The hidden children are the youngest survivors and not recognized right after the Shoah. The recognition, only the older generation as the main group survivors. And when you say something about that in those days, you said, what do you know? You were in hiding. And there was also no interest for these hidden child survivors. No one wanted to listen to you. And we needed to talk. We needed to express ourselves. Because it was a necessity to tell your story, your grief. But the child survivors, the hidden child survivors, were swept under the rug. You were not allowed to open your mouth. The first trauma is a separation from your biological parents. Although when you are a little baby, it is a separation. When you are still an unborn child, you know the voice. You recognize the voice of your mother. When you are born, automatically you have the smell of your mother. So this is a separation, even when you are a baby. While in hiding, sometimes you had to part from the family who were taking care of you because it was unsafe or they couldn't anymore. And my friend Ed van Tang, who was the mayor of Amsterdam, he changed 13 times his hiding place. Your loss of identity and a new identity. Your personality, you didn't know who you are. Changing every time. your name, your family, also a new religion. No voice. And after the Shoah, the custody fight. Gesina van der Molen is a very famous, between brackets, in Holland. She organized, after the Second World War, all the orphans, the Jewish orphans, that they are going to have a place to live for custody. It was a disaster. She was not non-Jewish, and she was the head of the committee who was taking care of that. 50% of the members of that committee were Jews. And it went so far that the Jewish members quit the committee. Yeah, then we come to these deceptive beliefs. I had to be grateful and thankful for being placed in a family or an orphanage. Can you imagine? Did you ask your own children that they have to be thankful that you gave them a roof above their heads, that you provided food, that you paid for their studies? But we had to be thankful and grateful. Then, when you have success, people came to you and said, because that happened to you, that's why you are so successful. No, it is despite of the circumstances. And definitely not because. It was very unimportant at what they told us, our past. We had to forget it. We hidden children, we are entrusted to strangers. Imagine all these parents who gave their children their own flesh and blood to strangers in order that we should survive. We are children of muteness. We were forbidden to speak and to grieve. There was no ear for us. Silence was our lifeline. We couldn't open our mouth. We had to do what we were ordered. If not, then we knew the consequences. It was our lifeline, not to open your mouth. I have great admiration and profound respect for my parents and all the parents who had, with indescribable pain in their hearts, to entrust their children to strangers, in the hope that their own flesh and blood would live. This life that they granted us should be cherished and passed on. We child survivors of the Holocaust have to open ourselves up and recount our grief to our offspring in order to build their lives in peace and tranquility. Thank you very much. I'm willing to answer all the questions, even when you think it's emotional. But if I don't show my emotions, when I cannot explain to you what it means, then you don't know what we are thinking, hidden children.
Tswi, could you perhaps just recap how old you were when you were taken in by this adoptive family, de Jong, and how old you were when your grandmother took you from them, please?
I was 4 months old when I was smuggled out by this 17-year-old girl. And that's why I only know my parents. My parents of the Shoah were the family de Jong, Mr. and Mrs. de Jong. And I was almost 4 years old, or 3 years old, that my grandmother came and found me by the family de Jong at the address where we have been evacuated.
And how did she find out about where you were hidden or who you were hidden with?
Well, my grandmother knew the address where I was in hiding, because it was very simple that all the Jews knew from each other, especially in the family, where they were living, even in hiding. So after the war, my grandmother, who was also in hiding by a member of parliament, she hitchhiked to Oosterbeek in order to find me. And she told me the moment she saw the house destroyed, she was in shock. I do imagine that you are in shock. And she went to the neighbors and they told her that we were evacuated to Spakenburg. And then she came to Spakenburg and she found us.
So you lived with your grandmother till you were how old?
I was 3 years old.
And then she looked after you for how many more years?
Till I was about 11. But she was very traumatized, very difficult. You know, I was traumatized and she was traumatized.
And she told you right away about your parents?
No. She lied to me. And it started already with my name. And how did I find out my name, my real name, is that she said there, the bookshelves, on the top shelves, you are not, the book is at the top, you are not allowed to touch that. Well, totally wrong. I took a chair one day and I took one of the 10 diaries of my father. My father wrote 10 diaries starting in 1932, and in the middle of April 1932, he started to write, and in 1942, he stopped. And when I took one of his diaries, there fell out a family tree. And there I saw Tswi Herschel, married to Amiel, and the son, Tswi Josef Herschel, born in December 1942. So 1 and 1 was 2 for me. That's how I found out the truth.
Now, Tswi, we have a question from somebody, Evelyn Ophir, saying, how was your adjustment to the state of Israel? But perhaps before you answer that question, in order to give it context, you mentioned to us that you were 3 years old when your grandmother rescued you, but took you from the adoptive family, the rescue family, and she looked after you till you were 11. Perhaps you can fill us in on your life from the age of 11. What happened after your grandmother was no longer looking after you?
Well, in the meantime, I got a new guardian, and that was even worse. This was a couple who were also very, very much traumatized. They were Jewish, and I was depersonalized. I was beaten up almost every day. And I had 2 lives. It was the life at home and my life outside my home. And one day when I was 18 years old, I was looking in the mirror while I was shaving myself. I asked myself, who are you? What do you want? And what are you going to do? Well, the first question was easy. My name was Tswi Josef Herschel. What I wanted to do, I knew exactly, but how? I had no answer. But I worked on it and I did it. And I was successful only for the simple fact that I approached everything in a positive manner.
And you were with that family till you were how old, Tswi?
I was about 7, but my grandmother lived there as well.
Uh-huh.
It was in one family actually.
And this was all in Amsterdam?
It was in Rotterdam.
Rotterdam. And you finished high school in Rotterdam?
I finished in high school in Rotterdam. I went to the primary school, and there I met for the first time anti-Semitism. All my peers in my class were children of collaborators. I was the stinking Jew,
Ooh.
dirty Jew, the Jew who was forgotten to be gassed. I had to fight, and it was a very unpleasant. It was the first really that I was pushed into a situation to be Jewish. And I didn't know because I was educated in a totally different direction. Even my teachers were anti-Semites. In high school, it was the same. Only I went to learn judo, and so I could defend myself. And then they had more respect for me.
And how old were you when you moved to Israel?
It was in 1986, so I was about 42.
Was that a big transition?
44, actually, I was. It was not a big transition. We used to come twice a year with the family to Israel. I did business here in Israel. And I knew one day I'm going to go on Aliyah. The only thing is I had quite a big company. And this was actually the hesitation because of the responsibility you have when you have so many people, employees, how to do and what to do. What happens was that a customer, really anti-Semite, I didn't know that. We were going to sign a contract, and just before signing, and the lawyers from both parties were there as well, he said, I'm happy that you are not a Jew.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, I thought myself, so I don't want to do business with you. So I asked the contract just to check that we have the same contract to sign. He said, of course. I said, yeah, but I'm very, I'm a yekke. So he gave me the contract and I tore it in pieces. And I said, don't do ever business with a Jew. And I walked out with my lawyer. When I came home, I said to my wife, enough is enough. Geniek is geniek. And then I started to work to get, to sell my company. And then I was successful in that. And then we went to Aliyah. Also my 2 daughters.
Tswi, did you have contact with the de Jongs when after you were an adult?
Yes, After this, I was forbidden to see my parents, my war parents. But after 6 months of nagging and crying, my grandmother saw that it was the wrong way to do, and she arranged a meeting. It was very emotional for both parties. And since then, I was allowed to see them more often, but it was never ever the same.
Mm.
But up till today, I have contact with their grandchildren, and I'm still Uncle Henk, Henkie de Jong.
And I presume you got them righteous amongst the nation status at Yad Vashem.
That's right. Not only my war parents, but also their 5 children.
Of course. And Tswi, we have a question here. Can you tell us more about that 17-year-old smuggler?
Well, I didn't know how I came to that family, de Jong. I asked my siblings and they say, no, we don't know. You have to ask father, but he passed away in the meantime. Also my mother from the Shoah, she passed away, so I couldn't ask. And then I started to investigate because there was one name, Schwenke, came every time also in the diaries of my father. And I found that Mr. Schwenke was my father's boss. Although he was my father's boss, there was a friendship between them. Even I found letters that were personal letters, private and nothing to do with the relationship, the work relationship. So I said, well, Mr. Schwenke, probably there is more. I will try to find him. So I wrote a letter to the municipality of Oosterbeek and asked them the address of Mr. Schwenke. And I wrote that I was looking for him for the nomination of the Medal of Yad Vashem. After 3 months, I got my own letter back. And on the back side of the letter, it was stamped from municipality to municipality. And the last municipality was Driebergen. And it says that Mr. Schwenke and Mrs. Schwenke passed away, but they have a daughter, Christine Schwenke. And she lived also in Driebergen. Driebergen is in the vicinity of Utrecht. So I called my friend in Amsterdam and I said, can you find out the telephone number of Christine Schwenke in Driebergen? At that time, there was no internet. And after 10 minutes, he gave me her number. I called her. And I thought she was an elderly lady. And then she picked up the phone and said, Bettina Schwenke, but so strong that I was not expecting that. So I said, Mrs. Schwenke, my name is Tswi Herschel, and I'm calling you from Israel. She immediately answered, are you the son of Nico and Ami? And I said, yes. And there was a silence, an emotional silence. So after a while, I asked her, Mrs. Schwenke, are you there? Then she said, very timid, I thought that you were not alive anymore.
Oh.
Well, we had a very long talk. I flew to Holland together with my wife, and I came to her place, 11 o'clock in the morning, and we left at 5. She told the story 3 times. When it was not the truth, that it was not 3 times exactly the same story. When we left, she put her arms around me and she was crying. She said, I thought I found a lost son back.
Mm.
I wrote an article about this. You can find it in the internet. It's in English and it's called Gathering Clouds. which was also published in the Jerusalem Post some years ago.
So we have a question here. Have you met and or talked to other people with similar experiences? What did they feel and think? Was it similar to you or was it very different?
I participated in three or four international conferences of hidden children. And I heard all the stories. And it's similar in a way. We all were given away in order to live. We have all the same problems in the beginning. First, I was angry at my parents. Why did they give me away? In my eyes, it would have been much better that they took me, then I didn't have so many problems. Then it was all over. But when I became myself a father, I realized to give away your child, what is going on in your head. You cannot imagine what they went through, and all the other parents, to give away your child. So I respect them, and more than that. And all the stories, what I heard from others, from other child survivors, more or less the same. I remember one of the congresses was in Holland, in Amsterdam. There were 500 hidden children, Dutch hidden children, all adults, all with families. But we felt safe, so we could express ourselves. We didn't need to explain. A few words were enough. When I was in a workshop with my group, and we were in groups of your age, and I was born in 1942. So I was there with 22 hidden children born in 1942. There were 20 females and 2 males. And then I asked myself, why? Why so many girls? And then I found out that boys were circumcised, and that was a big problem. And this is the reason that more girls were saved than boys.
Another question we have here is the family who you and your grandmother lived with after the De Jongs. Why did they beat you? And why did your grandmother tolerate your being abused?
Well, I was abused not the moment when she was there. And why the Jongs took me in, I was not the only one. There were another 2 Jewish boys, teenagers. One, he was sent away because he was dangerous. He didn't want to listen. The other, his name was Joop van Maurik, and that was not his real name. I don't know his real name. Unfortunately, he was 18 years old. Unfortunately, he passed away the day before the liberation of Holland. He was very, very ill. They brought him to a hospital. The family De Jong were very religious, and they wanted to save lives. He was the head also for the resistance in that area.
Right. Folks, we do have time for some more questions. If anybody would like to ask a question, please just type them into the chat box. There's plenty of time for more questions. Could you tell us a little bit more about your grandmother?
My grandmother was a very religious person. Even during her hiding time, she tried to eat kasher. And of course, it was very difficult, but she did it. She was a housekeeper of that family with 10 children. And that was in the north. And she was born in the same district in Friesland. So she spoke the dialect. And it was, they used to live in a small village in Balk. And she spoke the language. So it was not that she faded in, actually.
Right, right. And until what age did you live, after you left the de Jongs, until what age did you live with this family and your grandmother?
Till I was 18 years old.
Uh-huh.
Then I started to take care of myself. And well, I was fortunate that I was thinking in a positive way.
Of course. Very much so. Very much so.
I would like to tell you a few things about my parents.
Please.
My parents were born also in Zwolle. I was born in Zwolle. It was a small Jewish community with about 800 Jews living there. There's one Beit Knesset, and they were Dati. And my father was an accountant, and he wrote these diaries. And the diaries, he didn't write it, I have a headache today and I took a pill. No, he is analyzing very, very sharp the situation with the Jews in Holland, the Jews in Germany, and in generally about Palestine. They were, both my parents on a very young age, they were members of Nabut Yisrael, which is a Zionist movement in Holland. And they wanted to go on Aliyah. And in those days, you needed to have money, and it was not a sochnut or whatsoever. So it was very, very difficult. And they were actually poor people. They were not rich, that you could spend money and go on Aliyah. So they were actually caught into the situation. And my father and my mother were separated for almost a year in 1941. And they wrote each other almost every day a letter.
Wow.
And of course, I have it here, also the diaries. It's in my possession. And of course, they wrote, I love you, and as soon as it's possible, we are going to marry, etc., etc. But the hope, their dreams to go on Aliyah in these letters is undescribable. And after about 30% of reading these letters, my father wrote to my mother, when chas v'chalila something happens, that we're going to be separated, that we will find each other in the harbor of Haifa. And then I stopped reading.
Tswi, how did the letters and the diaries survive, as well as the calendar your father made?
My father was very clever. He put everything together in his archive, and he gave it to someone else, non-Jews. So after the war, my grandmother, she knew where this all was, and she came there and collected it.
We have a very interesting, controversial question for you. What's most interesting for me, and what we and some other educators argued about, is What do you think would have been better, to tear you away from your war parents just to make you a real Jew, or leave you with your war parents living without Jewish identity? What do you think about that today?
Well, it's a question that almost in all my lectures, they ask me that. To tell you the truth, I don't know. The only thing what I know is that I'm happy to be Jewish. And although I know the other side as well, I know the New Testament, and I use the New Testament in my lectures. And I did it again a few days ago with the World Commemoration Day of the Holocaust, because there was a nasty question. And when there's a nasty question, I have also a nasty answer.
Mm.
My answer was that the Jewish people, the only people in the world who accepted the New Testament, because it's written in the New Testament, where you get a hit on your left cheek, you turn your right cheek. And we did that for over 2,000 years. Today, we have back our own country. And when we get hit on the left cheek, we don't turn our right cheek. We hit back and hard. And you have to get used to it. Next question.
It's interesting to learn about the situation which you described in the schools of all the anti-Semitism, because it's not a common topic we talk about. We, of course, know about the denazification program in Germany and Austria. And the person who asked the question here would like to know if you feel that this denazification program also happened in occupied countries which had collaborators such as Netherlands. And if so, how did you feel it?
Well, first of all, it didn't happen in Holland. Even today, it's exactly the same. Anti-Semitism is also in Holland. I know Anne Frank. And when I ask people who dragged Anne Frank, her family and the others, out of their house, well, usually they don't know, but they say maybe the Grüne Polizei or the SS or the SD. They say no, it was the Amsterdam Dutch police.
Mm-hmm.
And then I come with the story of my family. My grandparents were working forced labor in Holland. They had to make ammunition. And in 1943, in the beginning of 1943, the Speer were cancelled. The Speer was that the Jews could go around or to work for the Germans, but that was cancelled. So my grandparents, the parents of my mother, walked from Drenthe back to Zwolle, where they used to live. And the moment they put their key in the front door, the policeman who they knew came on his bike and he said, you have to come with me. And he brought them to the police station. And they were there in the police station for almost a week. And he himself brought my grandparents to the concentration camp Westerbork. It's almost in the same vicinity. And in principle, all the authorities signed the intention declaration to work with the occupier. And again, Holland was not better and not worse. It was the same. But we are using it, they are using it in a different way that it's not true, because they have Anne Frank. And Anne Frank became an icon. And the moment we are talking about anti-Semitism, they pushed the button Anne Frank. 75 years after the Shoah, there was an apology by the Prime Minister Rutte of Holland. 75 years later. The survivors, most of them, passed away. And the ones who are still there, for me, and so many others, It didn't say a thing. 75 years to make an apology that they stole from the Jews, that they organized very well that the trains to the Vernichtungslager. The same did the king did that because of his great grandmother. I always, when I found out what she did, or let's put it this way, what she didn't do for the Jewish population, no.
So we have a very tachlis question. What would you say to the youth today who are becoming involved in anti-Semitic movements?
First of all, you have to find your identity as a Jew. That makes you strong. Then you
sorry, I think they're referring to non-Jewish youth who are becoming involved in anti-Semitic movements.
Well, okay, it's the same. You have to learn your past. You have to learn your history. When you study your history, you can determine your future. Then you don't make the same mistakes. But that's a problem today. No one knows or has knowledge of the past. But history, teaching history, is very, very important for life.
Right. We have a couple of questions about whether you wrote a book or whether a material of yours is available at Yad Vashem, perhaps on the website. Would you care to address that, Tswi?
I did write a book, but it's not published yet, and I'm rewriting it. Because when I wrote that book, it was in 90. Well, I visited the first time Auschwitz and all the extermination camps, and one of them was, of course, Sobibór, the place where majority of my family perished, and my parents. So when we were sitting in the bus and we drove from Sobibór back to Warsaw, I started to think to put my life in writing. And when I came back home in Ranana, in a few weeks' time, I wrote my life story. And I gave it to my children. And both said, no, we know who you are, but it's not suitable for publishing. So I'm rewriting it.
We have a rather different question this time. Were your maternal and paternal families Sephardi from the Inquisition, or they're Ashkenazi? How much intermarriage between Sephardi and Ashkenazi occurred in the Netherlands?
Well, the percentage, I had no idea, but it's a very nice question. Because my grandmother from my mother's side, the mother of my mother, she came from Emden, Ostfriesland, Germany. And that family, Falk, came in the 1500s from Portugal to Emden. And they were Sephardic Jews. But the one who was in charge in that fürstentum said, listen, I know the Jews from the East, I don't know you. So when you want to stay here in Emden, you have to change from Sephardi to Ashkenazi. And that's what my family did. They became Ashkenazi.
Right.
From my father's side, they already 400 years in Holland. The first Herschel was opera-rabbiner from Nesrit. And he came to Holland and he founded a Jewish community in Amersfoort, and he became very, very well known. The Herschel family was a very large family. But I'm unfortunately almost 99% were murdered.
So what, that leads into one of our questions. Did any of your relatives survive, and how did you relate to them, other than your grandmother, of course?
Well, it's so like this, you know, always you are looking for people who are your family. And I found some, although far family, even here in Israel, but we are family because we went through the same circumstances. So even when it's a very far family, we are family. And it's unfortunately a few.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question, and it might be too private, but it's your decision to answer it. The question is, what psychological help, if any, did you have in order to become so functional?
None. I use my common sense.
Mm-hmm.
There were people who said you need to go for psychological help. But I tried it once. And after 3 sessions, I said to myself, no. But it's not for everyone. I know that. Again, I have a positive way of thinking. And there is always a solution. And that's what I am doing. That's what I want.
So, Tswi, now that it's already 9 o'clock, I'd like to conclude because we are out of time. And I'm going to read one last comment to you because Andy Hunter really says this for everybody here, I believe. He said, "Thank you for an incredible and educative talk, so very powerful and important." And there's so many people who thanking you for this really fascinating and very informative talk, and really opening up your soul and bearing it to us and sharing these very, very painful experiences. And they're just saying thank you. We appreciate your sharing your life. Thank you so much. And really, they say it for everybody. So thank you once again for this talk. And thank you so very much for stepping in at the last moment. It was very, very helpful of you. We really appreciate it. So thank you once again. And we wish you everything of the best. Folks, we appreciate your joining us this evening, and thank you, and all the very best to you. Bye-bye now.
Thank you very much.